I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-created curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Welcome to episode 190 of the Time for Teachership podcast. Today, we're talking about leading change and getting, quote, buy-in. And we'll talk about why buy-in is in quotes in the title of this episode in just a moment. So first, I just want to name that leading change is challenging and resistance is part of the work. I'm sure as a leader, whether you are a teacher leader, a team leader, a school or a district leader, a leader of your community, a leader of fellow students, whoever is listening, leadership is challenging in all of its facets. And to support you in leading change thoughtfully and effectively, I'm actually going back to a blog post that I wrote 5 years ago. And so we're going to turn it into this podcast episode today. Thinking through the lens of both shared and adaptive leadership, which are concepts I talk about, and try to think about how to apply in specific scenarios throughout this podcast and blog. So enjoy. Feel free to check out a slightly adapted initial version of the blog post in the show notes or the blog post, there we go, for this episode today at lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/190. Okay, so leaders, if you have ever had an exciting idea that you just know it's going to be so good for teachers, it's going to be so good for students, but people are not buying in. And the biggest thing you need to do is, in your minds, convince them, right? Get that buy-in. So this phrase, buy-in, is an interesting one. And I've heard since writing this blog post, I knew at the time to put it in quotes because I wasn't a fan, but I have learned a lot of other different phrases in the intervening 5 years, just really leaning into words I used in other spaces like co-create, design together, thinking about the idea of shared leadership, but in more regular kind of verbiage, thinking about Ayanna Presley's, like the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power, right? Like those are the folks who have the solutions, the ones who are living it. So when I think about this, I think about the phrases that we also typically encounter that make us think, well, we just need people to kind of come over to the good side and see the path forward and get in line, right? So we often hear things like, maybe this is how I've always done it, and it's going to take a lot to change. I don't have time for this, right? There's a lot on people's plates, particularly when we're talking about education, right? It seems often that there is a scarcity of time, right? And we've talked about that actually in recent podcast episodes about kind of mind shifts around that. But I think looking at the research, specifically the leadership research, and identifying 4 research-based strategies that you can use to effectively lead change in a very, sustainable, but also really justice-centered and kind of shared leadership way is where we're going to go today. So the first few may sound familiar, and I'm just going to keep naming them because they're super important in the change management and what I prefer the term leadership in leading change literature. So first is to have one clear vision. So if you choose one goal for the year, maybe 2, or even, not even just the year, 3 to 5 years out, one goal for 3 to 5 years, the same one, that's really ideal. We found in the literature from major initiatives. So research on Massachusetts turnaround schools actually has found that the schools who did not make gains, it's in part because they lacked prioritization of a few key areas. So they actually were trying to do too many things at once. Really now, DESE specifically, Massachusetts Department of Education is saying, if you're in turnaround, if your school needs a revamp, a turnaround plan, whatever, one goal, 1 to 2 goals, right? And those goals, of course, should be data informed. They should be high leverage. And here's the clincher, they should be co-created with stakeholders, or because often we maybe lead districts or schools that have hundreds, if not thousands of stakeholders when we include students and staff and family and community members, right? And all the people, at least a representative stakeholder team where all stakeholders are authentically represented and we've had episodes on this in the past, but really thinking about even, are there a proportionate number of students or young people relative to adults that is actually the case in the school or the district or the community, right? So if we actually are proportionally as a school community, majority students, we should have the majority of students on a representative leadership team, right? Of course, there's a lot of nuances to getting folks in the space for having those conversations, making sure that students are compensated for that work and family members are compensated and teachers are compensated for this work. And that's a whole other episode. Feel free to tap back into the archives to find that. Today, we're going to stay focused on this piece. So also want to bring in the research from Manderchild and Kuzi, who talk about vision, and they cite big leadership names, Kuzi's and Posner, who find that, the clear vision really leads to, quote, higher levels of employee motivation, commitment, loyalty, esprit de corps, and clarity about the organization's values, pride, and productivity, end quote. So lots of things come out of that clear vision. We have this kind of energy surge that generates kind of more energy and a ripple effect across the staff. I would also say this probably extends to stakeholders. They were writing specifically about leading employees in a business environment in this research, but also just, stakeholders in general are going to be really excited when they co-create the vision, which means if you have students co-creating the goal, students are then going to act in ways that support the goal, right? So we have less of a behavior issue or whatever issue because it's do this as I say so. And it's really, hey, you co-created this thing that we want to work toward together. Let's do it. Like, let's do the thing. You helped create this, you're going to work harder, right? It is a little bit of seemingly like a duh kind of moment, for lack of a better phrase off the top of my head. But also, I think it needs to be said in the research for us to truly kind of believe it, particularly when we're working with young people, like, oh, right. Yeah. Like just a reminder that this is how like human motivation often works, right? So that shared leadership base, again, we're coming back and back to that. These researchers also note that it is important to measure progress towards the vision within performance evaluation. So if it's actually a priority, if this is really our one goal, we want to make sure that your feedback as a leader to teachers and your evaluation of teacher growth, your evaluation of student growth, the kind of like observational criteria you're looking for or listening for or wanting to experience and witness in classroom spaces and school spaces are reflective of that priority. So it's all in alignment and doesn't feel like the separate thing. People do get initiative fatigue. That is very, very real, particularly in the intervening 5 years since COVID has happened and lots of things have changed. And we just want to make sure we're doing kind of the less is more idea that I tell teachers all the time. We want to do that as leaders as well. Okay, next. And again, I think this is an obvious one. That's the word I was looking for, obvious. Make a space on teachers' plates if we are asking teachers to do things. Similarly with students or with families, right? We want to make space for them to do that, right? So we already are overloading people with things to do. So we can't really add to teachers' plates without taking something off, right? If it is a priority, same for us, right? If it is a priority for you as a leader, something else needs to go so you can devote the appropriate amount of time and energy and resources to it. We can't just keep adding on. That's a recipe for burnout. And in a time right now where teacher shortage is a very large issue, we don't want to contribute to that problem. We want to make space for the priorities and not add to the to-do list. There are several resources that I've shared, blog posts and podcast episodes about thinking about prioritization versus adding to your to-do list. How do you spend appropriate planning time making space for all the things that really help move the needle? And what does the research say are the things that move the needle? All of that. So feel free to use the search bar of my website, lindsaybethlyons.com, to find these resources, forward them to teachers, whatever is helpful. But I do think the big takeaway here is prioritization, not adding to the to-do list, right? We all have the same amount of time in the day. So it's really about, what do you want to make the priority today? We are not going to add time to your workday, leaders and teachers, talking to everybody here, right? Well, we instead want to see what is the most important. I also think on a student level, on an instructional level, we don't want to just keep giving students more and more and more things and overwhelm them. We're seeing really high rates of anxiety and lots of things from students that we don't want to add to it, but we want to maintain that curricular challenge the thing there is, again, prioritization, do fewer things better, right? As I have heard the brilliant folks say, Angela Watson, there we go, at her podcast. So that's two. All right, just to recap, these are have one clear vision, make space on teachers' plates. Now, number three is to connect with teachers' hearts. I'm consistently referencing teachers here because I think in traditional mindsets around leadership, it is feeling sometimes like teachers need to buy in, and the resistance leaders face in leading change is with teachers. But I actually am talking about all stakeholders here. Again, this was a blog post written 5 years ago. So going off of this, we really want to update my language here. So the prominent adaptive leadership scholar Ron Heifetz says, quote, what people resist is not change per se, but loss, end quote. I think this is hugely important. Even just a recognition of this fact is important. So I've actually had someone comment on this blog post just to say that this is the thing that resonated with them, and to just say, I really appreciate that being brought up, right? This idea of resistance as loss, huge in the adaptive leadership space. And again, that simple acknowledgement that teachers' identities are tied up with their jobs, right? When they shift, for example, from like sage on the stage mode, when they're talking at the students, when they're imparting knowledge, right, to a more effective pedagogy of the quote guide on the side approach, right, or coaching students, I'm helping facilitate student ownership of the learning. That's hard. And for a lot of teachers, there's going to be maybe a feeling of a loss of identity. Well, what am I even doing if my students can do it all by themselves, right? But we ultimately want teachers to see the value of the shift, that it is not about their loss as kind of the sage on the stage, of the imparter of knowledge, of the kind of know-it-all person, but actually you're moving into a more important and challenging. Really, you got to be like on your feet to do this well. You have to, that's not a great phrase. What am I thinking of? On the ball, on the, on top of things, ready for anything. Just kind of quick to respond. And you have to have this confidence and breadth of experience to be able to respond to what's happening in the classroom, right? We can't prepare for it all when students own the learning. So we want to coach teachers to see the value of this shift specifically, and that students actually benefit more here when we teach them how to be learners, not just what to learn. And it is important to empathize with and speak to that teacher identity and sense of loss of that, right? So again, we just want the humanity coming through here. We can use that empathy to kind of paint a picture of how the new initiative or the vision or the change, whatever is happening, speaks to their passion for student learning, right? Because of course, we won't be doing things that are bad for student learning in terms of our change efforts. And, ultimately, we are going to connect with why they became a teacher in the first place, and just helping them kind of co-create that vision of what that looks like in their classroom with the research backing, but also with kind of their hearts as part of it. And so we can kind of counteract that loss of identity and almost like recreate a new, better, stronger identity, if that makes sense. Now, if teachers don't seem ready for a change, Anderson says, talk and listen to them, share the data, let them discover the issue and the urgency themselves. So kind of share that research, share the student data, kind of create that disequilibrium of, oh, okay, I want this, but my current actions are producing these results, right? I see research out there on this topic that's saying we should do this, and then, right, that the kind of path is created for them. You're basically just bringing them up to speed with what you have witnessed, seen, reviewed, whatever, and making sure that you're kind of showing, this is the stuff in front of me. This is the stuff that I'm noticing, that I'm learning about. Like, join me on the journey. And of course, don't forget the heart, right? So leadership scholars Cotter and Cohen warn that many change initiatives fail because they just rely too much on the data. They are incredibly data focused to the extreme, so that they actually lose and don't inspire. They fail to inspire the creativity that is necessary for change initiatives by, quote, harnessing the feelings that motivate useful action, right? So when we're motivated to do something, when we're excited about the possibilities for change, when we're feeling really creative and feeling like we can affect change, efficacious, I believe that word is, then we are motivated to action. We are motivated to co-create the plan. It just kind of erases any of that resistance, or at least drastically reduces that idea of resistance to change. So again, pulling people along, not pulling people, co-creating, kind of lifting each other up, inspiring each other, motivating each other, connecting with our hearts and our creativity is the way to go. So in the blog post, I have added an image of the Kubler-Ross change curve, so common in kind of leading change spaces. And it may help you if you want to take a glance at it. It may help you recognize where teachers are emotionally during the change process and how you can support them during each stage. So I'm just going to narrate this so folks who may not have access to the blog post or have difficulty viewing the image can understand. So we have kind of this change curve that starts with like denial, and our impact kind of is going to go kind of down and then up in terms of negative, positive. So we are in kind of in a denial state. We're kind of like medium impact. We are in a state of kind of maintaining the status quo. Our reaction is kind of shock. It's not happening. The approach here, the recommendation for leaders at this stage when people are in a state of denial, is to communicate information. Next, after communicating information, people might move to a frustration space where the impact is even less, right? We're not impacting much. We may have kind of a state of starting to enter a state of disruption, though still perhaps in a little bit of a status quo state. We may see some of that remaining shock and denial, but we're also entering anger and fear territory. The approach for folks entering this space is to really watch, listen, and support. We're going to continue watching, listening, and supporting when folks may move into the next stage, which is depression. That is kind of the low point of the impact. So we're on kind of a negative swing. And then we're going to start going back up. So imagine kind of like a U curve here. We're at the bottom of the U, and we're going back up the other side. Now, people are moving into the experiment phase of the change curve. And this is a state of exploration. The reaction is, okay, I've accepted that this is what's happening. And as a leader, you want to give time and space here to explore, for people to test out things, really truly experiment, have that informed risk taking be celebrated, not penalized, right? And then folks will move to decision, which is where we're just starting. We have a little bit of that exploration still, but we're just starting to rebuild. We are in a state of rebuilding. We are committed. That is folks' reaction. We are committed to the path forward. And your approach as a leader is to celebrate. We are celebrating that co-creation that's happening. We've had folks kind of move through all these phases. There's a lot of emotion involved. We're kind of connecting to their joy of learning to experiment, trying things, taking risks, and kind of coming to that decision. I'm going to co-create and eventually move to integration, where like, yes, this is the path forward. It's part of how we do things. I am fully, part of this. That's the Kubler-Ross change curve. Again, speaking to that idea of connecting with teachers, or more broadly, stakeholders' hearts. Okay, the fourth strategy here that is research informed is create dissatisfaction. Create dissatisfaction, there we go, with the status quo. So I love Dana Miller's adaptation of Gleicher's change formula, which states that change equals dissatisfaction times vision times the first step. All of those three things, dissatisfaction, vision, and first step, need to be larger than resistance. So what this formula does, just to break it down, is it accepts that resistance happens, but it can be overcome as long as teachers or stakeholders, more broadly, can recognize their dissatisfaction with the way things are now. There's a clear vision for how it can change, like how it can be better. We know it's possible. And there are first steps that are acceptable to us that we can take. So the fact that the formula for our math folks out there includes multiplication, right? Change equals dissatisfaction times vision times first step is all greater than resistance, right? Multiplication then means that if any one of those, dissatisfaction, vision, or first step, is zero, like it doesn't exist, then resistance will win, because any number multiplied by zero is zero. And so, of course, any resistance will be greater than zero, right? So I love that kind of formula, noting that all three of these things are critically important for change: dissatisfaction, vision, and first step. If there is no dissatisfaction, if people are like, yes, I'm good with the status quo, they're in that kind of denial stage of the Kubler-Ross change curve, then leaders can create it. And in fact, Mesereau says they must create it, right? That adults actually need a disorienting dilemma, that's what he calls it, to jumpstart transformative learning. So this is learning that requires a paradigm shift, like a totally different way of looking at a problem or engaging, I should say, with a problem. And it asks us to critically examine our assumptions rather than just learn a new skill, right? So imagine, I'm thinking of a parallel here to curriculum. You give your teachers a new curriculum and you say, okay, learn it, do it. Okay, that might be fine if that curriculum is the same kind of pedagogy, the same kind of way of teaching they've been teaching. If that curriculum is actually drastically different, they've been, lecturing history lessons, reading from a textbook, and now we're learning through inquiry. Whoa, that's going to be different. That's actually going to require a paradigm shift. It's not just like a new skill that it's like, okay, boom, boom, boom. It's like I need to view learning and the act of teaching differently than I have before, right? So it's got me critically examining assumptions. It's got me in a disorienting dilemma, right? Like I see the way I've done things and I see the way I'm going to do things. And I see the research saying that actually that new way is going to generate student learning, more student learning, better student learning. And I need to kind of have that moment of, whoa, okay, change needs to happen. I need to recognize that. I need to examine my assumptions. That's what the disorienting dilemma does. It forces us to examine our assumptions. And so presenting teachers with information that makes them, and this is the key, just uncomfortable enough to realize that, quote, according to Mesereau, the way I've been thinking about this isn't working anymore, end quote. That idea, that aha moment, oh, the way I've been thinking about this isn't working anymore, that's going to help them try on other ways of thinking. Again, think about that experiment phase from the Kubler-Ross change curve and be willing to rearrange how they see the world. So this is the most effective when we're actually in group dialogue, in a context of like a team, for example, a whole staff, where folks are just able to briefly try on other ways of thinking. Sometimes it can be really, really challenging when you do anything with adults, with students that is brand new, and you're like, okay, go ahead, do the thing. Or like, I don't even know where to start. Like, I've never had this opportunity. I've never tried this thing before. I've never even witnessed other people doing this. So I'm not sure how, right? And so being in that group space is going to give folks just time and possibilities to kind of experiment and be in that experiment phase of trying on other ways of thinking. Okay, so go ahead and create a disorienting dilemma for your teachers. And remember that major transformation is usually made up of a lot of little changes over time. So you won't shift mindsets in one meeting. You just won't. So reduce that, lower that expectation of this is going to be real easy. But you can present the disorienting dilemma and let the disorientation start to sink in. When everyone is sufficiently disoriented, then they're going to be seeking new ways of thinking, and you're going to have an opportunity to introduce those ideas, right? So again, we're presenting the data, we're creating that disorienting dilemma, we're presenting the research, and we're remembering to connect with people's hearts, and we're going to invite them to ask questions, to seek out new ideas. We're going to put them in a group, right? Try on different ways of thinking. Experiments. Celebrate the risk taking. And to think about possible disorienting dilemmas for teachers, if you're like, I'm not sure what that even looks like, Lindsay, consider presenting a situation in which two values that teachers hold, or stakeholders, again, more generally hold, where those two values that they hold are in direct competition. For example, teacher finds themselves working 60 hours each week to complete their lesson plans, graded student work, all the things they have to do. This positions their personal well-being, which is important to them, in direct conflict with their love for student learning. So let teachers recognize the discontent there, right? That's not good. I want to be personally well, and I want my students to be helped. Explore the underlying assumptions. Example, this is the way it has to be. There's no way I can be personally well and help my students. Aha, let's explore that, critically examine that. Let them come to the conclusion that transformational change is the way. We need a paradigm shift. We need to do something differently to overcome the discontent. And then start exploring different ways of thinking that could address this dilemma. Share what other teachers who do have a better balance of well-being and student learning, right? See what other schools are doing structurally, right? Start exploring different ways of thinking. Once teachers get here, you can take them through the final steps of making that action plan, collectively make it. Don't put it just on the teacher, right? But how can I help? How can the structures help? test it out, build capacity for the new approach, provide support, provide structures, provide coaching, PD, whatever is needed. And then it becomes integrated, again, Kubler-Ross curve, integration into a daily practice of the teacher's lives or ways of being or the person's lives, right? So I'll link to Mesereau's 10 phases of transformative learning if you're more interested in that in the blog post. But that is kind of where we're kind of pulling a lot of this stuff from, is Mesereau's work with disorienting dilemmas. In conclusion, there was a lot there, and change is challenging, it's difficult, and it takes time. And these research-based ideas, they're going to get you started. The real work is in how you bring teachers, students, families, all stakeholders into the change process, right? The process is just as important as the final action plan or whatever is implemented, right? It is about the process. It's about community, shared leadership, adaptive leadership. Get at those underlying beliefs, do it together, co-create, right? And to help you with this, to help you kind of build up your shared leadership, adaptive leadership muscle, I'm going to share with you my leadership PD playlist. It has videos, it has podcast episodes, it has templates and resources and activities that you can grow your leadership capacity. So to grab that resource, you can go to lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/190. Until next time, everybody. If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no-strings-attached brainstorm call at lindsaybethlyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at teachbetter.com/podcasts, and we'll see you at the next episode.